Good evening, and welcome back to our online speaker series here at Harvard Hillel. One of the thought leaders that I turn to most frequently to think about Israel and the American Jewish community in general, especially during this time, is Yehuda Kurtzer. Yehuda is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. He's a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, on Jewish history and Jewish memory, and on questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. Yehuda led the creation of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America in 2010. I think there were just 2 or 3 employees at the time. Now it's more than tenfold that. It was a pioneering research and educational center for the leadership of the North American Jewish community, and teaches in its many platforms for rabbis, lay leaders, Jewish professionals, and leaders of other faith communities. I've had the pleasure of having Yehuda as a teacher in some of these programs. He's the co-creator of the Shalom Hartman Institute's I Engage project, which seeks to bridge between Israel and world Jewry through content, curriculum, and cutting-edge educational programs. And he is the host of the very popular Hartman podcast, Identity Crisis. He's the author of Shuva, The Future of the Jewish Past, and the co-editor of the New Jewish Canon, a collection of the most significant Jewish ideas and debates of the past 2 generations. He received his PhD from Harvard and briefly and proudly served as interim undergraduate program director at Harvard Hillel when someone went on maternity leave. Yehuda, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Of course, delighted to be with you.
So I want to begin actually with a quote that many might be familiar with, and I'm sure you are, from Jonathan Safran Foer. And he writes, Jews have 6 senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, memory. While Gentiles experience and process the world through the traditional senses and use memory only as a second-order means of interpreting events, for Jews, memory is no less primary than the prick of a pin, or its silver glimmer, or the taste of the blood it pulls from the finger. The Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. It is only by tracing the pinprick back to other pinpricks, when his mother tried to fix his sleeve while his arm was still in it, when his grandfather's fingers fell asleep from stroking his great-grandfather's damp forehead, when Abraham tested the knife point to be sure Isaac would feel no pain, that the Jew is able to know why it hurts. When a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, what does it remember like? Yehuda, you've written a fair amount about memory. And I guess the question I want to start with asking you is, what does this past month remember like? What moments in Jewish history, what Jewish texts or pieces of liturgy has your mind turned to process these events?
Great. I know that quote well. I wrote about it in Shuva. I think a lot about the strange dynamic that we have as Jews of being the inheritors of this rich textual liturgical past. We evoke it all the time with a future sensibility. Sometimes we engage in these paradoxes of trying to imagine a future ideal condition based on some conception of the past that never existed. It's beautiful paradoxes about time. I think there are two things that I've felt deeply evoked over the past month. One was not as much historical trauma, but a lot of the past month felt to me like a large-scale metaphorical rendering of liturgical time and at the time around death. The first few days following October 7th felt like what the Mishnah tells us is the category of the onein, a person who has a dead body in front of them and is exempt from all sorts of obligations. And it felt that way. It felt like I couldn't think, I couldn't focus. I was like crippled with grief, and it felt like that gift that the tradition gives you of you're not supposed to focus on other things. You're not allowed to. I was in Israel during the second week after this transpired, and we were chatting about this before. It felt like a Shiva on a national level, hushed voices, weird store hours, a lot of actual Shivas. And then the last couple of days, we marked Shloshim, and in Israel there were quite a few actually ritual moments around Shloshim. So it had actually felt like take this idea that's usually atomized to individuals on how we process our own death and grief and map it onto a whole civilization. And so that's like the liturgical version of that story. In terms of like memories and historical trauma, I did write something the first week after the war when I saw one of the there was this like immediate anxiety that came from some sectors, the Jewish community. Jews are going to start making irresponsible historical analogies to our trauma, and it's going to make things worse. Like the fear that if I think about this through the prism, for instance, of Amalek, those who cut us down in the worst way possible, that it's going to make us therefore have a bad Jewish public policy or Israeli public policy towards Palestinians. And I wrote a piece in JTA. I was like, we are allowed to use traumas and language of our past to process and digest. I said, I'm not making a claim that anybody is ontologically Amalek. I want to make that argument, but I can feel that I finally understand the phrase Amalekite behavior. So what Hamas did on October 7th was Amalekite behavior. And so I wanted to, I don't know what the answer is. I'm fourth generation American. My family doesn't have Holocaust memory, right? So it's not like I can evoke that personally, or I'm fourth generation American. But I have been kind of playing with what is this like? And I'll give you one other analogy. I spent I've learned for my whole life about the impact of the Kishinev pogrom on shaping modern Jewish political consciousness, this massive pogrom at the beginning of the 20th century, which is one of the levers that shifts Jewish attitudes towards Zionism and the kind of like pessimism on diaspora. Kishinev killed 49 people, and it looms so large. So this is something big, and it's the first time in my lifetime, maybe the Rabin assassination is the far distant second, the first time in my lifetime where it wasn't just what does this evoke from the past, but I felt like I was in a moment that was going to be the past sometime, that was going to be a historical turning point that would become mythically and liturgically significant to Jews in later Jewish history.
So obviously you're talking about this will become a mythic point at some point in the future. We're only, say, 30 days out. But so far, what do you see, or what do you already occurring, or what you're expecting to see as some of the most kind of cataclysmic changes spurred on by October 7th?
Well, one of the complicating variables, needless to say, is that October 7th is not just an attack, it's also the launch date of a war. And so that's both a second layer of kind of grief and trauma in Israeli society right now, is as I felt like I wrote in a piece in the forward, like I felt like Israel was the valley of the shadow of death, because there was all this death in the rearview mirror and all of this fear of death that was impending because of sending 300,000 soldiers potentially into Gaza and onto the northern front. So that gets in the way. It's like, if you have a pogrom and you can't really respond, but you can lick your wounds, you can start making mythic meaning. When you actually have to fight a war, it's like weird to, like, am I able to spend that time kind of processing? And actually, I fear for that. Actually, one of the most poignant things that an Israeli friend said to me when I saw her in Israel a few weeks ago was that her son works with soldiers in the army around trauma and post-traumatic stress. And his job, the way she characterized it, was he was trying to make sure that the soldiers she was working with remain traumatized and don't move to post-traumatic stress, because they're not going to get healed of their trauma instantly. But if they go to post-traumatic stress, they're in real trouble. So that's what I feel like. There's like a kind of weird holding pattern. So I don't know yet what it means. I certainly know what it means Jewishly. I think we could talk about this. I think there is a seismic shift underway in American Jewish politics around liberalism, around allyship, around intergroup work, which is not just political in nature, but it feels like there's a moral move, the emergence of a different kind of red lines that were before. I think one trend that we're already seeing among Israelis is this deep recognition of a kind of existential loneliness that Israelis experience about their plight, and the willingness that Israelis have to say, I'm going to fight this war regardless of whether anybody likes me. So those are a little bit of the that's where I see a little bit of the genesis of significant moral and intellectual shifts that may happen in the Jewish people.
I've got two questions one on allyship and one on kind of boundary making and red lines. So first, part of your work at the Shalom Hartman Institute has been to build allies, to kind of build bridges between not just the North American community and the Israeli community, but also programs meant to build bridges with non-Jewish communities. I'm curious sort of what you've seen there in terms of allyship. I know a lot of people, especially in the progressive community, have felt let down, felt abandoned. How are you feeling, as an individual in those relationships that you've built, as an institution, and what are some of the lessons that you think you've learned?
I'm going to say this diplomatically. It's a bad time to lean into that work, and maybe the wrong time. Some might say, actually, no, now more than ever. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that with the level of trauma and grief that the Jewish community is experiencing, with the level of fear and trauma that Muslim Americans hold in relationship to the people of Gaza, that it's actually really possible to break through that right now. And the more damning problem is that by definition, maybe we don't have as much intimacy with war, but by definition, war polarizes and it kind of makes you have to choose a team. And when you are in that place, even if you're only 51-49 on your own team, you're still on a team, and and because of all the algorithms, we're going to curate information the way that we're going to curate it. It makes us not only skeptical about people on the other side or angry at them, threatened by them, it also makes us repudiate those who refuse to take a position, who insist, who kind of all lives matter, the whole thing. And I think the best case scenario around a lot of that work is it goes into a holding pattern. We find a way to leave it as the stuff where we're able to, once this war is blessedly over, say, wow, that was awful. What's next? How do we pick up the pieces? I'll tell you, like at Hartman, part of the reason we got into Jewish Muslim work was because we felt that there was so much potential for the American Jewish and the American Muslim communities to do more together. They're approximately equal sized. They have similar socioeconomic patterns, similar ideological predilections. There's interesting things about religion and sincerity between these two communities. And at the same time, every effort around interfaith group either was so politically aligned on Israel-Palestine that it was basically in the tank, usually on the left, or got derailed by Israel-Palestine. And so we said, we're going to center the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as part of the curriculum of the learning together. And I hoped it would win. I'm not sure it did. And we still find ourselves in a place where we are pulled apart because of the depth and the integrity of our commitments, the fact that we're at war. So I'm really worried about the nature of that work.
Are there lessons? I mean, if you could go back and redo some of that planning in advance and that community building, are there things that you would have done differently, or do you think it's really just inevitable given the facts on the ground in Israel?
I mean, there are two things that I want us to do differently as a Jewish community in engaging with other allies. And I don't think we did them poorly before, but it doesn't matter. You're gonna have to keep doubling down. It's like even if it's like a sandcastle that's getting washed over by the tides, okay, we're gonna build it up again. There's two things. One is we are not as good as we think we are at communicating. And by we, I mean the mainstream majority of American Jews. We are not as good at communicating. And I think it's partly because we haven't figured it out ourselves, what Israel actually means to us. And as a result, our allies are oftentimes led to believe that Israel is, well, you're a Jew and there are Jews there, or Israel is like a political commitment. If its politics are good, you like it. If not, then you're angry at it. And actually, for most American Jews, we have a weird, uninterrogated, textured, complicated relationship to the state of Israel that's connected to this thing called peoplehood that's actually really hard for Muslims and Christians to understand to begin with. And because we haven't fully solved that meaning of this for ourselves, we're not great at talking to other people about it. So that feels to me like you want to make the agenda for interfaith work really has to start there. The second thing, which is more technical, is I really believe that allyship is savaged by the fact that people think their allies are the folks that agree with them on issue X or Y, but really good allies are actually people with whom you have created contracts, ideally explicit ones. This is what I want from you. This is what I expect from you. This is what I don't expect from you. I think the relationships that fell apart over the past month were effectively uncontracted relationships. I wanted something from you, but I never really told you. And then you let me down, and I'm angry at you, but you're like, why would you be angry at me? Why would you expect that of me? And that would be a change of like, this is what I want from you. This is what I don't expect from you. And it sounds, people don't like to use that language because when you talk about contractual, it's like, does it get in the way of real relationships? But the truth is, we know some of our most powerful relationships are bound together by actual contracted commitments. And I think that has to be a big piece of what allyship should really look like.
I think anyone who's ever listened to a ketubah being read at a wedding, a contract being read at this romantic time, knows that the two things can go together. I want to remind our audience,
yeah,
we will be taking questions from you in a little bit. There's a Q&A icon that you can see at the bottom of your screen. Click that icon, type in your question, do it by name, not anonymously. And that way, if we select your question, we'll invite you to come up and turn on your camera and ask Yehuda your question directly. Please only type in a question if you're prepared to come on. Yehuda, the question, so you're talking more about their allyship with other communities. Let's think a little bit more about within the Jewish community. I think in some ways, the events of October 7th have brought a more diverse group of Jews together. Certainly in Israel, we see that. There's sort of a picture that I saw of someone who was for the judicial reform and someone who was vocally opposed to it, who were serving together. I don't know if you've seen that photo.
yeah.
And at the same time, it also has meant that people who are now slightly more on, usually more further on the left, actually have now felt like they're completely excluded, and either explicitly they're made unwelcome or implicitly made unwelcome within the Jewish community or parts of the institutional Jewish community. So I'm curious, how do you think of that? Is that inevitable? And if not, should we strive to have all Jews feel like they can be a part, or is drawing boundaries at this point something which is actually appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, you gave that one example of a photo. There's also a great Eretz Nehederet clip from Israel, which shows the commanding officer calling Israelis onto the bus to go to war. I don't know if you've seen it, but she calls out, she's got a checkboard. She's like, anarchists, Bibi supporters, racists, Arab lovers. And it's just this whole thing where a country that's been so deeply polarized has actually managed to stand together unusually well. It's not a perfect story of solidarity in Israel. There are news reports of a certain type of repression and suppression of dissident voices in Israel, and there's a lot actually that's very dangerous right now vis-a-vis Palestinian citizens of Israel in this moment. But there is a kind of much more wall-to-wall support for this war than anything in Israel for a long time. And I would say, actually, what I've been surprised by, Donnie, is more wall-to-wall support in the American Jewish community that I would have expected of the American Jewish community. We've tracked and watched an American Jewish community where there's been a real erosion of the peoplehood sensibility for a long time. And I wouldn't have guessed that American Jews would have kind of showed up first emotionally the way that we did, that signaled we are part of the same body, to paraphrase Rabbi Soloveitchik, or that we would actually behave with the mechanisms of solidarity that felt reminiscent of the kind of 1950s fundraising campaigns, Israel bonds, that whole stuff. It's been pretty extraordinary. That said, you're right. There is a peeling off, I would say, on the left-hand side. And by the way, before I get to the left, it even has created fascinating results on what you call the right side. Agudath Israel, for whom anti-Zionism was like an important part of who they were, is like playing Hatikva and raising money for Israel and supporting the parade, the rally on Tuesday. So that was really interesting. There is a kind of peeling off on the American Jewish left, There are a few hypotheses around it. I think that a lot of those folks have been so overwhelmed by the wall-to-wall thing and have so defined their political identity as Jews as against what the American Jewish community is doing, that it's forced them to a more radical posture than they've been before. There's no question that there's a sense of urgency around the violence. It's so grotesque and it's so profound that it's having the same effect. It's the same war phenomena of polarization. And I am watching and seeing. People talk to me all the time about Jewish communal trends. There's going to be real consequences in Jewish organizational life for folks who are lined up on the left flank and the left camp. Now, you use the language of like people feel excluded, but I think we want to actually give people their agency back. People are also staking a position that is against the overwhelming majority of American Jews and staking a position that is overwhelmingly against the overwhelming majority of Israelis. And if that's where folks want to stand, that's where they have to stand. But you can't then come around and say, you stood outside the tent, you maybe even tried to knock down the poles of the tent, and then you're angry when the community is like, get the hell out of our tent, or stay away from the poles. So I do think something is changing. Obviously, whenever that happens, you get nervous about overreaches. I'm more interested in seeing some renegotiation around institutions of Jewish life and particular organizations than I am about individuals. Individuals are messy, right? A lot of people show up to rallies with wildly different opinions. But I think we're going to have some overreaches, but in the short run, maybe we are seeing a little bit of a renegotiation. As one Jewish leader said to me, who's been a kind of committed pluralist for a long time, we're now playing we're playing between the 20s, football metaphor. I'm willing to say that the action takes place here, and I don't really want to engage anymore or keep as part of the game those who refuse to be between the 20s.
I'm curious, what are some of the other biggest challenges that you think are facing the American Jewish community in general or institutions? I know you've written some about this on Facebook. I think at some point you said that your Facebook posts are not on the record, so I'm not a journalist, but I'll let you kind of decide what you want to share with
mixed feelings about that. They are on the record because they're public. It's more that I want journalists who are quoting them to tell me that they're quoting them, because it's really easy to take things out of context, especially when you're kind of thinking aloud on Facebook. But that's another discussion. I think this whole solidarity question and the renegotiation of the boundaries is one big issue. I think the question of, will the Jewish community do incredibly well at sending vast sums of money to Israel to support Israelis dispossessed from the South and to support the military effort. And also they're going to raise a lot of money to securitize Jewish institutions, right? All of that's going to happen. And I'm nervous that the bottom is going to fall out of the Jewish philanthropic economies to support the basic stuff of Jewish life. I've been at a few federation events around the country because I've been speaking, and you can hear this palatable anxiety. We're going to crush it on the emergency campaign, and we're going to fall short on the annual campaign. So that's like in the Jewish communal economy piece, something I'm worried about. And a little bit more on the idea side, and I think this is worth our discussing. I don't know. I'm nervous that American Jews don't have the stomach for what state power and war actually entails. I'm really worried about it. I don't know that we have a coherent enough ideology as American Jews to understand what war means, what we call at Hartman like a Torah of power or a narrative of power. I think diaspora Judaism is built around a different set of concerns and considerations. And I'm worried both about the capacity to stand in solidarity with Israelis as a war wages, but also long term for whether our Jewishness is going to be capable of assimilating what it's going to take for Israel to win this war. That's something I'm quite worried about as well.
So on that front, I think in there's sort of the bigger question of just Jewish power altogether, but then there's also more of the specifics. And I'm curious, kind of, you've written about how we have to balance our solidarity with Israel as a broader American Jewish community, and support for the war itself, while also being prepared to stand and be critical when we think the war is not being fought justly. So there are two challenges there that I sort of see. One is just the question of how do we even think about this morally? And I guess a question I have for you, we had Michael Walzer on a few weeks ago. I'm pretty sure you're a fan of his, but who are some other thought leaders that you turn to of how to think about this? But the second, I think, is also a certain kind of epistemological question, which is where do you even look to understand what's actually happening on the ground, right? So we had an extreme example a few weeks ago with this hospital explosion. But I'd say more generally, if I'm trying to think about, is the Israeli military conducting itself morally now, putting aside even the theoretical questions, when a bomb goes off or a Hamas, target is struck, I have no idea exactly, the significance of that. If I'm trying to assess proportionality, who else was killed and why, and sort of where do you turn to even get those facts? Because to me, it does seem like a lot of the details are what really matter, and not just even false headlines, but just an accurate headline in the newspaper doesn't seem to present enough of that information.
Let's say something uncomfortable. I don't mean it to you, but I mean to you in the larger sense. It's not really about you, and you're not the arbiter about what actually transpired, certainly not in real time. You're not capable of it. We are all subject. We have this profound deception that we are doing to ourselves, that the widespread availability of imagery and news is actually giving us clearer access to the things that we're actually seeing in real time, and it's false. The actual information and news has fallen way behind the culture of misinformation and disinformation, which, by the way, that's been part of war since the beginning. It's a war tactic, disinformation. But it's much more sophisticated than we're capable of seeing and knowing. And so we have this incredibly arrogant Western liberal sensibility. I see it, I evaluate it, I criticize it. And how many times are we going to have a situation like the hospital bombing where until we say, I don't know yet what I've seen, I can't validate it yet, and therefore whatever opinion I say about it is irrelevant. Not only irrelevant, but possibly even immoral, because you're making a claim about some reality that you're testifying to based on the absence of information. And we know that when we come to those conclusions, they have huge effects on human beings. They have huge effects on whether the war gets continued to be prosecuted, huge effects on attitudes towards the war around the world, which in turn has consequences for anti-Semitism, sometimes for Islamophobia. Like, these are hugely consequences decisions that we make. So we may have to take a posture that we don't usually like to take, that we're not really capable of knowing, that we have to have some epistemological humility during wartime. You want to call it fog of war, a healthy skepticism and a distrust of the news and information that is being curated by algorithms that are not designed to help us understand things, but to polarize us or to entrench us in our positions or to make us angry. Maybe the hardest thing to do is to say, I refuse to exercise judgment right away. And then it goes to your first question, which is, Walter's an easy one. I love the piece he wrote this week in the Atlantic. I think he called it "The Oppressed Still Have Obligations." Shayla Ben Habib wrote a similar piece on Medium, and I really, what I love is when people who come from a particular political worldview hold the people in their own worldview accountable. I didn't agree with everything that Walter said or everything that Ben Habib said, but I felt like they were saying, let's be honest and wake up about what's taking place here as relates to Hamas. And what I particularly liked about it is it took them 3.5 weeks to write it. And I felt like, for people who trust ideas and scholarship, the blog version of how do I interpret what happened on October 7th is probably worse than the Walzer version that took 3.5 weeks to write. And that's maybe one of the other pieces of discipline that we have to do. And part of the reason I think we're resistant to that is we think we're political actors. If I come to this conclusion right away, I can alter the course of the war. Outrage. Well, outrage is profoundly misdirected if it's not actually driven by real information, much less wisdom. The last thing I'll say is I turn to my colleagues inside the Institute. Oftentimes, for years now, when things happen in Israel, I'll read about it in in American press or even in Israeli press. And then I check with Israelis who are living there. And they're like, well, nobody really thinks that. But I saw, I watch different channels and there's a little, I get panicked about something and they're like, well, nobody really cares. So there's something about trusted witnesses inside the societies that we care about. I have a podcast coming out on Tuesday with Tal Becker, who's been a huge leader in the field in Israel around the whole legal questions of war. And he like really helped me and scared the crap out of me with what he was telling me about what the extent to which I don't know. And I, it's good in moments like this actually to embrace a little bit of humility about the certainty that we're inclined to trying to gravitate to in moments like this.
Thank you. Reminder again to our audience, we'll be moving to audience Q&A in about 10 minutes or so. So if you got a question, please type that in now by name. I'm curious, what are some voices that you've come in contact with or people or experiences in Israel, whether through your personal relationships or through your connection to people through the Institute, that you think probably many of us are not actually seeing or hearing that would be important for us to know about?
I speak professionally for a living and I'm very comfortable doing that. But sometimes people like me, ironically, are not the best at small talk. But when I was in Israel, I really tried to just make small talk with Israelis because I felt like I was on this big Shiva visit. There's actually a huge amount of public leadership and thought leadership that's out there right now. We talked a little bit about it before. I think that's what your question is leading towards. But I was very affected by just chatting with the waiter in the restaurant that I was in. And, this woman who was a storekeeper, where my wife sent me to she's like, buy all the jewelry in the store. And if they don't have it, just give them the money. It was kind of like that feeling of just go help. This person, like totally normally, in like a totally even keeled tone of voice, is speaking to another customer and is like, person asked her, where's your husband in his military service? And she said, well, the good news is he's in the Kiryat now in Tel Aviv because his job is identifying body parts. But now that the whole southern Israel is a military zone, they've moved the body parts into Tel Aviv. So she was like happy that he was secure in Tel Aviv and not on the front line, even though what he's engaged with is a basic act of re-traumatizing himself over and over again. And he's in this horrific role of basically creating Avelim, creating mourners, because if he can correctly identify that somebody's actually dead, somebody can move from this liminal stage to mourning. And I'm raising it only because I just chatted with her for a little bit, and I felt like that was what I needed more of. There's so much analysis, but what I really needed was just understand from Israelis, what does patriotism feel like right now? Understand from Israelis, what does army service look like? Understand the human cost that this is taking on Israeli society, which is layer upon layer. When I was there, it's changed now, but the schools were all closed because first of all, the men were gone, but also there are no bomb shelters. Jerusalem doesn't really have bomb shelters for the schools, so they couldn't credibly go back to school. So you just get layers of personal stories, and I would encourage people, lean into personal relationships. You're going to learn a lot more from those to be able to form more deeply held positions than yet another thought piece that comes out.
I'll tell you one experience is a little bit different, but also I was in a restaurant a few weeks ago and I forgot to pay and they forgot to ask me to pay because everyone was just so distracted. So I went back today to pay, but I think just kind of a sense of, for me, that was a moment where just, everyone kind of their mind is elsewhere.
Yeah, distracted, yeah.
I want to shift focus a little bit now. I'm curious what you think of, what's been going on college campuses. This is, obviously we're speaking to a Harvard audience. You have degrees from, I think, 3 different Ivy League universities.
It feels like some who shame right now.
there are some who have been arguing for a while that the liberal arts kind of climate on is where I guess the approach on a theoretical level is inherently flawed and unwelcoming to Jews, and they're using this as a moment to say, I told you so.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you feel about that. I'm also curious, what you think is the role. Our call is not everyone here is from a Harvard audience, but as a lot of either students, parents, alumni, Hillel professionals. So, how do you advise us, and what do you think our role is in this moment?
I'll give you a thought experiment that I was working on last week, which is there's this language of kind of exodus from the university, which I don't think is going to happen, but a language of this universities have become sites of moral corruption, and it usually manifests in like three different places. It's either the administration, which usually puts out statements, couldn't put out a statement here, which is usually packaged together with these concerns about how DEI has become an agenda on campus in ways that has alienated Jewish concerns and separated out, parsed out anti-Semitism as whiteness. That's like one body of concern. The second is more particular to the intellectual climate on campus, especially in the humanities, which has become, like you can see it, visibly narrow-minded in ways that misrepresent the whole premise of what the liberal university was supposed to do. You genuinely, in a lot of elite campuses in certain departments, there's profound orthodoxy on certain set of issues, and Palestine is one of them, and that's like a second piece. And then the third is like the climate for students on campus and the culture of protests, and whether it feels like it's productive discomfort. Students are like arguing with each other, or even good counter protest. All of that feels like fair play, or whether it's unproductive discomfort or even unsafety. And those feel like so first thing I would say is like, I want to make sure that when we approach the university, we're actually parsing out all three of those, because I think they require really different interventions to try to solve for them. And I'm nervous that the announcement, campus is bad, anti-Semitism is rampant, doesn't actually give you any tools to figure out all the three different kinds of interventions. And there's probably more issues that I'm not even raising. But I got like, excuse me, I had a little thought experiment, which was in the 1930s, famously, and before and after, there was quotas at elite universities around Jews. They were certainly not hospitable climates for Jews. And the way that the American Jewish community responded then was that it was like, oh, you're anti-Semitic? We will beat you. And what American Jews did is they actually leaned into the universities, invested in building departments, basically embraced that the university should be a better version of itself. And the university became the strongest mechanism that American Jews had for social and political and economic mobility. Like, we basically held universities accountable to being the bastions of liberalism that they were supposed to be. So what I'm nervous about is that the folks, basically the neocons who are dunking on liberals right now, being like, see, we told you all along, all of this was bad, and are claiming like you should leave the elite universities. Like, we know how to do this. Lean back in, right? Like, how might Jews be part of working with administrations? I haven't read it closely, but I saw the letter that came out today from the president at Harvard. That feels like okay, great. Now you have a strategy with the administration and a language of accountability. We haven't really been, maybe we haven't been really paying attention to this. That's like one. The second is, what do you do to secure and make robust the experience of Jews on campus? That may be work that lives closer to student life, Hillels, etc. And then there's that third middle piece, which is academics, which I actually think is the hardest one to tackle. I think there are endemic characteristics of the academy. It's not going to make me friends with faculty who are here, that like the conditions around tenure and life expectancy basically make places into greenhouses. People have hardwired views. They don't leave that context. It biases who they consider to be doing other interesting research, right? There's a confirmation bias of people's own political views. And and you're going to need, I don't even know what the answer is on how you fix that culture in the humanities. I genuinely don't.
Is that a problem that you think is only true more recently, or going back, say, 20 years when you were in school, or even further?
You know, when I was an undergraduate at Columbia, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on in the MILAC department, Middle East Language and Cultures. And I sat in on one class, which was ostensibly about Islam, but it was really about Palestine. But at the time, and this was like right before the Second Intifada, at the time, it was kind of, I would say for me at least, it was kind of pleasantly combative. A lot of Jews took the class, a lot of pro-Israel Jews took the class, argued with the professor. It never rose to the level of making Jewish students, most Jewish students, maybe others had different experience, feel intentionally uncomfortable. I never felt coming away. I felt like, in some ways, that's supposed to happen at university. You're supposed to confront ideas that you're not comfortable with. Actually, what you're supposed to confront is the best version of ideas that you're uncomfortable with. And it didn't trouble me all that much. Second Intifada, I think, moved the needle. And I think I think we're basically in a totally different planet now in a lot of these campuses. And it's been a deep entrenchment of these views. And as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the militancy of the pro-Palestinian position has crossed lines. When you see an argument by a Yale professor that all Israelis are settlers and therefore occupiers and therefore legitimate targets for attack, when you see the kind of weird way in which the language of an oppressed people is entitled to its resistance by any means necessary in a moment like now, we've crossed lines about what's a credible position within that can be tolerated within a framework of liberal pluralism. What that means, Donnie, also is that I don't think the humanities really, by and large, cares about liberal pluralism anymore. So that's part of where we have that's a bigger intellectual challenge in front of us, is to insist on the necessity of those tools, both as tools, like the way in which a university society should operate, but also maybe as like larger moral and epistemological commitments that people should hold to.
I've got two final questions for you.
Yeah.
And then we'll move to our audience. So one is, you're in charge of a research and educational institute. I'm curious, there's so much energy right now that we see within the Jewish community. I mean, the Harvard alumni community has activated the Jewish Harvard alumni community like it's never been before. More students coming to Hillel. I think I read somewhere that Jewish stars are selling out all over the place. More excitement than there was in kind of before this moment. And I'm someone who there's little that excites me more than kind of attending a Hartman style program. How do we use this moment? And I'm going to ask sort of you for your own institute that you're in charge of, but also in terms of advising those of us who are Jewish educators and work in that field or adjacent to it. How do we use this moment to take all this energy and make sure that it is actually sustained going forward? And hopefully the world returns to at least something that it isn't right now, and Jews can live sort of safely and not have to only be thinking about their security. And in that world, how do we make sure that people are still excited and activated about Jewish life, Jewish commitments, Jewish learning?
Great question. Yeah, we're seeing this it's wild. I mean, our podcast numbers are completely bizarre. They've spiked enormously. Every program they do is oversubscribed. We've heard anecdotally from around the country that synagogue attendance is way up. We've heard from Hillel directors that Jewish students are showing up to Hillel much more than they did before. The short-lived version of that is, well, during a war, people need community and they need wisdom and they need safety. And so those are somewhere along the trajectory of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but people are kind of searching for all of those things right now, and therefore they're going to go. And the minute they start feeling, when the cloud lifts, they have a clearer sense of who they are and understand things, they feel safe again, then they're not going to come. So what's critical for Jewish institutions right now is to make sure that what we're offering is not merely the stuff of protection, safety, solidarity, but engaged in some body of work right now that is actually constructive. Use the window of opportunity that is forward thinking. So I don't want Hillels to simply say, great, students are coming and they want a safe environment from what's taking place elsewhere on campus, so we're going to take care of them. I think that's a really important work, by the way. More of it, like students should feel that this is the one place that they can go where they get a hot meal and some pastoral and spiritual or psychological psychic support from peers and educators. But now's also the opportunity to lean into what's the courses that we're now teaching to students who are showing up to help them build up their understanding, not just of what's happening in the news, but what it means to be a Jew, what it means to engage seriously with Israel. We have to basically use a window of opportunity to do a lot more, I'm calling it constructive work, forward-thinking work right now, because I'm wary and worried that that the window will only be for the stuff that's about safety and solidarity.
Great, Yehuda, thank you. I'll save my question maybe for the end, because I know we have a bunch of folks who are willing or excited and eager to ask you some questions. But thank you so much for answering mine so thoughtfully. We're going to turn first to Josh Greenfield, who's an alum of Harvard College. Josh, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thanks, Yehuda. It's great to hear your perspective on this, and especially it feels very calming and reasoned, which I appreciate. The question I was putting forward, I guess, was, what's your worry about how this will affect, not even like in the immediate future, but in the medium to long term, the way Israeli Jews and American Jews see the world differently or see each other differently? Just because I think that the metaphor of Shiva was very interesting, where you have like a death and then sort of a slow process of kind of coming back to the world and re-engaging with everything. I think it's going to work very differently for people who live in Israel and for people who don't. No matter how much we may visit or identify with those people, it feels like the trajectories will be different. So I'm sort of just curious to see how we think that might play out and what we can do about it.
Yeah. So a couple things. One is I'm not sure that this one is going to play out as differently as previous eras of violence, because the sheer number of American Jews who are one degree of separation away from victims of October 7th or hostages taken on October 7th is much, much higher. It's just the numbers are totally different. So whereas, ex-terror attack of 2005, 11 people die, Israelis in the neighborhood are rattled. Israelis in general are rattled. American Jews are like, oh, that's sad. There's something else happened here, which I think is going to linger for a long time. And our shul, which is admittedly a little bit of a kind of insider shul, but it's still a suburban conservative synagogue in America. The rabbi did an activity in shul where he basically had this kind of stand up if you know somebody who, and by the end, virtually the entire shul was standing up. So I think the proximity is higher, and proximity is just one of the shortcuts to kinship ethics, which is ways that you stay connected. I think that's one. I think the second way to answer this is I think it's a test. I actually really think it's a test. Israelis were overwhelmed every time I speak to them by the shows of American Jewish support. They're grateful for it. They feel overwhelmingly alone. They feel an existential loneliness. The phrase that I use a lot is from the philosopher Jill Stouffer, called ethical loneliness, who argues that victims of trauma and violence are sometimes wounded a second time when people don't believe them or don't take them seriously. Israelis are basically experiencing an epidemic of ethical loneliness. This happened to us. We're responding the way that most normal human beings were responding. And now we're being referred to as genocidal. We as American Jews could decide collectively we're not going to make them feel alone. And it's going to stretch. This goes to what I said to Donnie earlier. It's going to stretch our instinct to be like, well, I'd prefer to take a critical posture right now and wait and see. Do I really agree with how you're fighting this war? And so I pushed myself, my team, my organization, and American Jews. Like, there's a big rally on Tuesday. I hate rallies. Israelis must see hundreds of thousands of American Jews show up, because they're seeing the other version, which is a lot of very publicly visible American Jews show up who are arguing against their convictions right now. I really am desperate for us to pass that test for exactly the reason that's underlying the question that you're asking.
Josh, thanks so much for joining us and for your question. We're going to turn now to another Harvard or Radcliffe alum, Nancy Israel. Nancy, thank you for joining us. You can turn on your camera and ask your question.
Thank you very much for this program and for the other programs you've been running. It's really interesting and informative. I wanted to ask, and I may have misunderstood, but it sounded like a fairly broad brush that Jews on the left or progressive Jews may have no place in the tent right now. And I know many young Jews, not just young Jews, but particularly young Jews, identify as progressive and are feeling quite torn. Are you saying Jews who also are concerned about Palestinians have no place in the tent, or are you?
No, heaven forbid. Yeah. Heaven forbid. No, there's no such broad strokes. I am deeply concerned about Palestinians in 3 places right now. I'm very concerned about the loss of innocent civilian life in Gaza, which I view as a situation, a humanitarian crisis brought about by Hamas. I'm extremely concerned about settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank right now, which is being driven by forces in the Israeli government who would like to make this not a fight between Israel and Hamas, but a fight between Israelis and Palestinians. And I'm really concerned about Palestinian citizens of Israel right now. So there's no reason, there's certainly not a question of, on one side is pro-Israel and the other is compassion. That's not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is a segment of the progressive left whose knee-jerk instinct is not, I want to stand in, let me put it like this. It's not, I am in some ways a character witness to the state of Israel, whose position is either I judge the state of Israel favorably so profoundly at the outset that I'm going to argue against its actions instinctively. I'll give you an example. A Jewish publication published 5 days after October 7th, before Israel had fully launched the war in Gaza, published a piece, had not written anything about October 7th, but published a piece saying Israel is perpetrating a genocide in Gaza. That is an ideological decision about kinship and who you stand with and who you trust. I think those kinds of decisions that are taking place right now are the kinds of decisions that are decisions to be against as opposed to with. I know it's a very crude way of expressing this. And another variable that I would just put into place is I would challenge those who instinctively oppose Israel's right to fight a war against Hamas in Gaza right now, which feels to me like an essential thing that Israel has to do. I want to challenge those folks to show your work. Show me nation states who would abide by this. Show me an understanding of the ethics of war that makes this kind of fighting illegitimate. And I think it's actually very hard to do. I think it's actually just an impulse to disagree, and that's what I'm pushing against.
Well, thank you for the clarification, because it's
yeah,
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for joining. We're going to turn now to Rossi Walter. Rossi's a Harvard College alum, and he joins us from Japan. So it's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you so much for being here to speak. It's really, really interesting. And I've been taking some notes, and when I became a panelist, they all disappeared. So I had a moment of panic, but I remembered the question, in essence, that I would really like to ask you and hear your answer on. And it concerns an earlier topic that you spoke about on contractual allyships. And I was just curious if you had, I'm sure you do have, some thoughts on I'll read what I have here. Like, what are some of the red lines, the hard boundaries, the founding points that might underpin an example of these contractual relationships between organizations? For example, Holocaust acknowledgement, commitment to education on anti-Semitism, on the state of Israel, or specifically the right of the state of Israel to just exist. Wondering if you have some ideas about what that might look like for an organization or between organizations. Thank you.
Yeah. let me get at this, but I want to just put it in context of how I think about red lines, if I can. I think there's basically two ways to approach the red lines question. One is that you come out of the gate with your commitments, and you insist that anybody who you're partnering with adheres to those commitments. And that approach, by definition, will limit your allies in your political communities because you need people to subscribe to what you hold to. There's a second way to do this work, which is to basically be constantly compromising and negotiating with anybody you can talk to, as long as, this is the philosopher Avishai Margalit's compromises and rotten compromises, as long as once you hit a place where you feel you have compromised on something deep and profound that is a core commitment, you are willing to stop and end that relationship. So I'm not sure that it was always that contracting always has to be the first thing that you do. It could be that you build relationships, then you discover, I can be with you on virtually everything, but I've reached a red line. I need to tell you my red line. And maybe it's precisely because you have a powerful relationship with the other that they're capable of hearing you in that moment and saying, I understand now. I have a feeling that most multi-faith, multi-ethnic coalitions are going to have to use that kind of strategy. If the Jewish community says, we're going to stipulate what our commitments are on Israel at the get-go, it's going to really narrow who can be in partnership with us. So that's one thing. Intra-Jewishly, I think it might be a little bit different. Intra-Jewishly, I think you're going to see a lot of Jewish institutions say, you know what, we weren't clear. Some basic support for Zionism or the state of Israel is a sine qua non to belonging in our communities, and we're willing to endure the consequences. And I guess what it comes down to is, are we ready and willing to contract in order to adhere to our commitments? And I think that's a really hard decision. I'm not sure the American Jewish community broadly is going to be able to make that decision, in a coherent way.
Rossi, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining us. We're almost out of time, but Yehuda, I do want to ask one final question. What is giving you hope in this moment that feels so dark?
Such an American Jewish question. Israelis, you ask them, they're like, nothing. Look, it's very moving to me how many people have been showing up to everything. It's very, very moving to me. It's very moving how many people are seeking community and wisdom and solidarity right now. I think that actually matters. It's very moving when you hear about students showing up at Hillel and the support that they're receiving. That makes me feel like when the going gets tough, Jews are reminded that like the core activity you do is you live in community. And because American Jews, our sensibility around community has been eroding for so much time, I'm glad to know that that's still there. I feel a sense of hopefulness around, I know this is banal, but I'm going to talk about my kids if that's okay. I have 2 teenagers and a 10-year-old, and I see the way that they are awakening to the Jewish people. It's not an intuitive thing, like to grow up in America and to feel this a belief in something called the Jewish people. Sometimes you can educate it and inculcate it, and sometimes you experience things in the world and you say, oh, wait a second, I belong to something bigger than myself, and that sometimes means joy and sometimes it means suffering. So when you see that, that's partly why I'm also a little bit cynical about those who will say, look, the future of the Jewish community is those who are standing against the state of Israel. I'm like, well, I don't think your math is right. I look at like the huge number of Jewish schools and kids around the country who are awakening to belonging in the Jewish people, and for whom that means standing with the state of Israel. So those types of things make me feel hope. And, we are, we're covenantally forbidden from being pessimists. We're covenantally forbidden. It's like part of if you believe in the covenant, you believe that there's a positive outcome. If you believe in the notion, not like a not scary version of messianism, you're supposed to believe that the future is better than what you're in. So it's not easy for me right now. It's hard. I'm having a hard time praying. But I do hold on to that sense of like Jewish history is long and we're only in a piece of it. And number 2, if you're a Jew, the most optimistic thing you can always say is it could always be worse.
Yeah, hearing you say this also reminds me of something that stuck with me that I heard from you a number of years ago, which was that there's in some ways a fundamental difference between those who can remember 1967 and those who were born afterwards who don't. The sense of the fragility that not to take Israel's existence for granted. Even people who become very critical of Israeli policy still sort of treasure its existence, and those who didn't live through that time can't really fully understand that. So hearing you talk about your kids also, this might be another crucible moment where just having lived through this will be something that will affect them for a very long time. Yehuda, thank you so much. I always learn so much from you. For those of you who don't already know about the podcast that Yehuda hosts, it's really wonderful, Identity Crisis. You can find it on all your podcast channels. And I'd say that we're very proud to have you, even though you only worked at Harvard Hillel, I think, for a couple of months as an alum. And thank you so much for enlightening us during this tough time. And I wish you and your family and the entire world well. Thank you.
Take care.